This is the Federal Mobility Policy Update for May 3rd, 2021, with Beth Osborne from Transportation for America, Aminah Zaghab from the Energy Foundation, Lisa Jacobson from the Barr Foundation, Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, and Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. This week, President Biden addressed Congress and released his annual budget. Also, Congress is drafting the infrastructure bill and separate spending plans for highways and transit. What needs to be done to advance this promising agenda? Then we'll have a special deep dive from three people in philanthropy on the shifts that climate funders need to make. If the biggest source of climate pollution is transportation, do climate funders need to increase spending beyond EVs to include support for walking, biking, and transit? All that and more on this week's extended episode. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. This week, a two-part series or session. We're going to first talk about what's been happening in the Beltway and outside the United States. Also, we're going to be talking to funders about what are the three shifts in transportation philanthropy that need to happen for us to make the progress and meet the aspiration that we all have. With us today, we have our colleagues, Martha Roskowski from the Mobility Collaborative. Hi, Martha.
Good morning.
Good morning. And we've got Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's break down so much that's happened in the last week. Let's break down what's been happening. Let's start with the State of the Union speech. I sense that there was actually a 50-50 split for the first time. Of course, I'm kidding. But if you look at the speech mentions, the administration and specifically President Biden mentioned roads one time and transit one time, electric vehicles one time, climate 7 times, and jobs 43 times. And Beth, as you said, nothing gets into that speech without intentionality. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the speech. I'd be interested in both of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it wasn't just the mentions that I found interesting. It was the way they were mentioned. Like you said, every word is litigated, and it's, you know, it's quite a process to put these speeches together and make sure all of the important issues and proposals are covered and how they're covered in a sentence or a phrase. And when President Biden spoke about infrastructure, he talked about fixing and modernizing our road system. But he talked about building more transit, which, I think is appropriate. We have not invested in transit the way we have in highways. We have a robust highway system that does need investment to bring it up to state of repair and to make it work more efficiently as a system. But we simply have not done enough on the transit side. And so hearing the president talk about it that way was very exciting.
Martha, what was your sense of the speech? You saw it.
I continue to be impressed by President Biden. And I think he's trying to back up what he says with action. And I wish him luck. You know, I was struck that he talked about jobs, like you said, 43 times, clearly the focus of this work. But he did not go to the place that we usually see in terms of transportation, which is we need to build more highways because that's jobs, making that inexorable link that the way to provide jobs in the transportation world is expanding highways. And I was sort of watching the speech, cringing for that moment when that would come, and it didn't. So again, pleasantly surprised by that. And I think it gives us an opportunity to help reframe what jobs in transportation look like, because they are talking about, significant investment in transportation and, helping to show that it doesn't mean we just have to go out and widen more highways through, low income communities in the middle of our cities. And he did connect that to electric vehicles as one source of jobs and industry. I think, let's get to the next step of what does that infrastructure investment, what else can it look like in terms of, transit operating? That's a lot of jobs.
Yeah, I think that's right. It feels like we always look at these speeches for crumbs, and it felt like we almost had an entire piece of bread or maybe a half a loaf, which is so much more than in the past. Let's talk about things that are actually happening on the Hill. There are two measures right now. There is the infrastructure bill, which has been announced, and then there's the annual 5-year reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act. We've heard rumblings that they're either going to be connected or not connected. Beth, what are you learning?
You know, I just don't think it's decided yet. The way the House handled it last Congress was they did pass the reauthorization bill, and it was wrapped into a broader infrastructure bill. If they tried that again, I think that people would notice that there's a delta between the reauthorization bill and what's called for in the infrastructure bill for transportation. Those numbers don't line up. So there need to be some conversation about whether or not they're going to add more funding for things like rail that gets a really robust investment in the American Jobs Plan, but not necessarily in the reauthorization proposal, and whether or not transit gets a bump up. Because remember, in the American Jobs Plan, between rail and transit, it's almost 50% of the surface transportation spending. But in the reauthorization, it's nothing like that. So there's a lot yet to work out. And the understanding is that these are issues that they're working through both at the committee and the leadership level. And right now, it might look like they're working on parallel courses, but they aren't. Behind the scenes, they are trying to figure out ways to wrap them together and do it once.
Okay, great. Let's now turn to the budget, the actual fiscal budget for the fiscal 2021-22 year. What does the Biden budget look like? We have all these different pieces. They're all theoretically positive on alternative forms of transportation, but what is this budget, recognizing it's just a starting spot? What does that contain?
Well, the first budget is not as detailed as budgets that will come in the future are. And that's for the obvious reasons that instead of starting the budget process, which they actually do about now for next year's budget, they started working on their budget in January or early February. So it's much more of a general messaging document this time through. And therefore, there's a lot that isn't quite clear in it, not obvious how much of what they're proposing is attributable to assumptions made about funding that might come from the American Jobs Plan, how much is part of the underlying program, and how much is a call for just new programs. But some of the things that were in there include a $625 million program for a passenger rail competitive grant program. There's more money for the existing passenger rail grant program known as the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grants, which are much more about state of repair and safety improvements, but has been used to add rail service. There's a good amount of money for transit capital investment grants, a 23% increase over existing levels. There's money for low and no emission buses. And there's some money for a Thriving Communities Initiative pilot program to help communities, quote, improve access to destinations and foster community vibrancy. That's an exciting concept. We have a Thriving Communities program as part of my team. So it's great to see that terminology being used, but what exactly that will be, we'll have to wait to hear. And lastly, there's continued support for what has been called at times Tiger Grants, Build Grants, and now has a new name. I think it's Renew Grants.
No transit operating funds in this budget.
No, and I will say in the budget, that's not terribly surprising because the emergency funds were supposed to cover this fiscal year, but it does start to become an issue. We didn't see a proposal for operations in the budget. We didn't see a proposal for operations in the American Jobs Plan, and we haven't seen a separate proposal for ongoing operations funding. And my understanding is the concern is that that would lead to displacement of local funding and not additive funding to expand transit. So I think that's what's going to have to be worked out.
Great. So we've got both the budget moving forward. We've got these two packages moving forward. I've had the opportunity to listen to a variety of people who are saying that from a tactical and strategic standpoint, the next 3 weeks are crucial. And in particular, transit advocates are saying what's not in the infrastructure package is funding operations. Now, we've funded operations through the variety of COVID-related relief bills, but it's not in this. Could you explain a little bit about where we are moving on that and why are funding operations for transit? What are the chances of getting it in? Why are the next 3 weeks crucial?
So this is a huge ask. I want to start by reminding people of what an enormous shift this would be. I think sometimes we get so excited by our past victories, we forget how big of a victory they actually were. So there has been a very bright line at the federal level between spending money on transit capital improvements and transit operations. And the notion was the feds would invest in the capital, the physical infrastructure, and the locals would pay to operate the system. That has been a sacrosanct line. And there's been flexibility for very small areas, rural and small cities, but not for the big ones. And we broke that line down in the middle of COVID because it was an unprecedented event. That in and of itself was a big deal. It wasn't included in the Recovery Act in 2009. It hasn't been included in disaster bills in the past. This was a real break. The question is whether or not we can convince Congress to allow that line to blur going forward. And that is still an area of great sensitivity. What's good is we do have interest on both sides of the Hill, and we are working with offices in the Senate and the House on what a potential operations program might look like, addressing issues of how do we make sure that this adds service, that this extends service into new areas, that it adds quality, adds frequency, things like that. But the fact that we have folks that want to talk about introducing legislation is very exciting. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we can announce bills and who those folks are. But this is a tectonic shift in discussion about transit. And as you said, Darryl, the next few weeks are critical. We need folks to continue to feel the pressure to address this issue and get people comfortable with the notion that this should be a part of the future of the program.
So what does that look like in terms of, our core audience of funders and others? Make phone calls to their members of Congress, drop them a line?
Yes, I think that they're, never discount a lot of letters coming from constituents. Letters are better than emails, phone calls are better than letters. But these things get logged in, and when they hear from a lot of people on the same issue, that becomes a matter of discussion in the office. That means you have to hold a meeting and figure out, why are you hearing on this issue now? Who is it coming from? Do we need to take a position? Do we need to just send a letter saying we'll consider what you're saying? And so getting a bunch of letters or calls at the same time says, ooh, we probably need a position, not just a we'll keep your views in mind letter. So that can be helpful. Holding events with your member, inviting them to a roundtable locally, having them visit the transit service, talk to transit users, whether in person or virtually. That's another great way to go about things. Pulling together folks in your region to work together and showing that there's a breadth of support. I will say that, what people need to hear is that there's a wide variety of support from this. This is not just folks on the far left. This is not just folks on, one side or the other. It's not a narrow constituency. It's a broad constituency. And I would look to make the arguments that are surprising. When you can make a business case for it, that gets people's attention. So getting your local chamber, getting your local businesses involved about how important it is to get talent to their facilities so that they can run, or customers, that's going to be the most powerful argument for why you want robust transit programs.
Sounds like job number 432 for our local advocates, our advocacy groups. And I just want to say thank you to the place-based funders who are supporting the local efforts, because it's not only making a difference locally, it's also, channeling up to the federal. That's probably our most effective way to move things on a federal level.
That's right.
Local people talking to their members of Congress.
And that's a way of also saying that the infrastructure necessary to do that, not the actual lobbying, but the infrastructure necessary to do that, in part can be helped by the Mobility Fund, which is a joint fund of national funders and place-based funders. If you're a funder, we encourage you to learn more about that and to join us. It actually is what a delightful and fun group of people to work with. And it's informed by people like Beth. So let's close this session out. I know you've got to run. You have a hard stop, Beth. We always end our chats with kind of a, not frivolous, but just kind of a fun question. And today is the 50th anniversary of Amtrak. The president is going to Philadelphia to celebrate that. I still think there needs to be an Amtrak 1 train. Where will we be in 50 years? And given that we are never just optimistic, we are also pessimistic. Let's hear from both of you. Where will we be, both positive and cynical, with the 100th anniversary of Amtrak? Who wants to start?
I'll start. Go ahead, Martha. No. I want to hear what you say.
I want to hear what. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say woo woo, which is what my boss at the city of Boulder always did when the train people came in. Woo, woo. Okay, that's optimistically, we would have functioning rail between our major U.S. cities. We have a lot of places where the density makes sense, where the travel patterns make sense. United States has done a lot of great things. We built an interstate system. We could build a really, really good rail system that makes sense. That would mean that there's more than one train a day that comes through Denver, Colorado. It's the biggest city for a long way around, and we get one Amtrak train a day that often runs late because it takes second priority to freight on private lines. So, okay, we could do really great rail. Cynical, Amtrak really needs help. And I'm not sure that the current structure, the current way we're funding it, and the current way we're doing it is going to get us there. So I think we need a big rethink on how we do passenger rail, high-speed passenger rail.
So my optimistic side is based on what is possible, and a lot of it is what Martha just said, that we connect city pairs. I also think we should be seeking to connect rural communities that don't have very good airport access to the regional airports, rather than trying to keep very, very small airports operating. A lot of those are going away because essential air service is going away, and we shouldn't just leave them stranded. We should use rail and connect them into those hubs. I also would really like to see a focus on top quality service, frequent, regular service, and creating a good basic network, and then talk about high speed. You'll hear me say the same thing for rail as we say for highways. Speed is not the point. It's the quality of connection end to end. And all the countries that have great high-speed rail now built it on top of a robust and integrated system of regular speed rail. They didn't start with the high speed. And that's what we need to do. Yes, we're behind and we want to catch up, but you don't catch up by leapfrogging the basics. We have to get the essentials right. The negative side of me says we'll be exactly where we are right now, because we won't make the decisions that need to be made. I had someone ask me yesterday, why don't we have the rail service that other countries have? And the answer is because we don't want it. You invest in what you want.
All right. So my optimistic viewpoint is that we have three basic things, and I think nothing else matters. That we have fast, frequent, and reliable service. That's what we need. Fast, frequent, reliable service. That's what we get in 100 years.
Sign me up.
Yep. And then my optimistic or my pessimistic notion is that all that happens within 100 years is that Amtrak's Empire service finally has a dining car where you can actually sit on the train, go from New York to Albany, which I used to do all the time, and actually get food. So that's maybe that happens in 100 years. That's my pessimistic viewpoint. But we don't end on a pessimistic viewpoint. We end on an up point. And I think we've got a lot moving. If you told me a year ago that we would have all these things in play and that we would have we would have received $69 billion for transit, it's pretty amazing. So we are in an exciting time. And how do we harvest that exciting time? Well, that's the next section of this broadcast. Martha is going to take over and interview 3 funders about where they see philanthropy needs to go and where philanthropy is on activating the opportunities that we have before us. I want to thank Beth. I want to thank Martha, and we'll now turn it over to the second portion.
Aminah Zaghab from Energy Foundation. Welcome. Thanks for being here. We also have Lisa Jacobson from the Barr Foundation, and my trusty partner in crime, Darryl Young, who for this is going to take off his facilitator, moderator, questioner hat and be just part of the discussion as a funder. So let's start out. Aminah, you framed up our 3 questions, I think, really well. We're going to hear from Aminah, and then we're going to dive deeper into each of these 3 quick hits. So Aminah, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all for having me and for giving me the pleasure of getting to work with you all. I've learned so much. I'm somewhat new to philanthropy. I've been in it about a year, and I think there are 3 things that have been kind of mode shifts, if you will. We're trying to move away from the car puns to all mobility puns. That's a sub-bullet. But 3 things that have really been shaping how I think about transportation funding with a climate lens. The first is we need to change the system to address the sector, right? Everything in transportation is systemic. We need, electric drayage trucks at ports. We also need to change labor laws so that burden falls on the right folks. We need electric buses, but we also need to make sure those don't sacrifice service, which actually needs to be expanded and become more regular and more accessible. We need safety, and we need to know that folks can get from point A to point B without polluting the planet or risking their lives. And that includes issues like policing, as we've seen African Americans be killed by the police while they are transporting themselves. The second is on community-centered solutions, right? This isn't to say there isn't a huge role for states and the federal government to play in creating policy levers and giving billions in investment, right? But the fact is communities know what serves their folks best, right? How they want to get from point A to point B. And really trusting that and making sure that we're investing in that. And then the third, and this is one I think we have good company on, but we'll see. Transportation is the top source of climate pollution in the United States. It is not the top source of climate philanthropy in the United States. And this has happened despite the fact that transportation emissions continue growing. And I think one thing I've really learned and really enjoy working with all the folks on this call and also in the collaborative is the fact that we actually need everyone who cares about electric vehicles and transit and livable communities and ports and stopping highway expansion to come together and realize that we actually need a bigger piece of the pie writ large.
Whew, those are pretty meaty. All right, so let's take those one at a time. Let's start at the top. So changing the system, right? Transportation's this huge bureaucracy, billions of dollars, multiple decision points, and that's just transportation. That's, and then you have to think more broadly about what transportation affects and how it integrates with everything else, because it's not the goal in itself. It's just, it's like it's a piece of the infrastructure that we have of our whole country. So systems change. Lisa, how about let's go to you, Barr Foundation. You all have been investing in transportation, mobility advocacy, climate advocacy for a long time. So what's your take on systems change?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here, because I think Aminah put so well, this goes way back. This goes back to redlining. This predates redlining. I mean, the legacy of policies and regulations and laws that have shaped where we are today are going to take decades to untangle, as they've taken decades and made an impact over so many decades. I think that the legacy of what we're working with today has informed how Barr approaches transportation. And I think in the two primary ways are that our mobility strategy focuses on transit, walking, and biking. And that's a long-term shift to have our climate emissions, or our transportation emissions, for more people to take transit, walk, and bike as opposed to drive a car, is a long-term game. But that is where we want to go. That is a major culture change, a systems change. Our eye is in the long term. That's one piece of the Barr transportation strategy or mobility strategy. But the other side of our strategy is the land use piece, because we know that we're not just taking transportation for joyrides, although my kids definitely take the bus and the train as joyrides. But what are we trying to get to? What do we need to access? Who needs to and wants to take transit, walk, and bike? What are they trying to get to? So the land use piece, what does our zoning look like? What do our land use policies look like? Where are we growing? How does this all impact how much we're driving? If we're incentivized to drive, is also long-term. We know that development takes years and years and years, but we still have that as part of our strategy, because that is a major systems change and a really important piece of the transportation puzzle and the emissions puzzle.
And you've also, though, Barr has also invested in parking and congestion, exploring pricing. Is that an outgrowth of the transit, walking, biking?
Carrots and sticks. Yeah, carrots and sticks. I mean, in my previous days of my Nelson Nygaard hat on, which is where it was before Barr, we would joke that people are either lazy or cheap. You think about parking, like, you can price it and be really close up front. Maybe you're kind of lazy, you want to park right there, or you're cheap and you're okay with parking far away and you'll pay less. I mean, these are real behavioral things and how we think about how we use our transportation system. So addressing kind of all the pieces of the puzzle, the carrots and the sticks, the transit, walking, biking, and the land use is super important to get to where we need to be.
All right, Darryl. And I'd say as we go along, y'all feel free to, dive in. Like, this isn't just a grilling here from me. Darryl, you've been thinking about livable communities for quite a while and, pretty broadly. So what's your wisdom on the systems change piece? Like, what works?
I don't know that I have wisdom, but I know that we've started to think about, the systems change model, the thinking in leverage points that Dana Meadows put forward so many years ago, was where do we multi-solve? How do we solve a variety of challenges that are both an interlocking pathology, but also can exacerbate problems in each sector? So when we looked at funding, because we're not a huge foundation, we said, where are people not playing as much of a role? Where are foundations not playing as much of a role as they could be, and how can we organize and help collectively focus all of our work? And transportation was the area where we recognized that there was a climate imperative around transportation, and it felt that so much of work had been on the grid, not the grid of transportation, but the grid of electricity, and which is important, and we certainly fund in that space. But how do we talk about social mobility? How do we talk about economic mobility? And that mobility is the tie to all of those. And so I think Aminah is absolutely right that the notion of system, we have to change the system. And if we care about equity, if we care about the economy, if we care about climate, and if we care about land use and just a livable community, the thing that ties all of it together and gets us there is mobility, is transportation. And we tend to talk about, as funders, individual modes of transit, whether it be just biking or just electric vehicles or just buses. And I think Aminah is right. We have to think in a systemic way that if we have the scarcity of just focusing on a single mode, we're all doomed to failure. And I think that's something that's common about the mobility collaborative, the mobility and access collaboratives. We see it in a systemic way that says, yes, you can fund and you should fund, and we need to fund electric vehicles, but it also has to be in service of these other things as well. And so I think that's the change you see starting to emerge among funders.
But we need more friends in this space. I mean, Darryl, you alluded to it. This work is really hard. Like, there's not that many of us. It's a long-term view. It's really complicated. The policy work is in the funding streams. It's super complicated. So there's not that many of us. It's hard work.
It's daunting, right? Because first of all, you have to have a grasp of transportation. And you said to someone, what do you think about the new revisions to the MUCTD? People go, what are you talking about? It's the guide for how streets should be designed. And there are equity considerations in that. And I think it's daunting to most funders because they just don't have the background in it. I would not profess to be an expert in this area or even have deep knowledge around this area when I started. Not that I have deep knowledge now, but it helped that I was on the board of the Transit Center Foundation, where I learned so much. And we started to fund people like NACDO that were starting to do some of the not performative, but the transformative work. That's how I think foundations jump in. We are all there to provide information. We often will say, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then someone will say, here, read this. This is really good. So I think that's the advantage of this collaborative. There are newer and larger funders who can play a much larger role. I think that the temptation for them is to just do their own thing. And I think we cannot get there unless we get there together with a larger set of funders. So you're absolutely right, Lisa.
Yeah, so I'm going to segue to our second topic, and that's around the community has the solutions, community self-determination. And I think about that a lot in the context of, now the Biden administration, it's like doing some good things, they're actually talking about an infrastructure bill. Secretary Pete Buttigieg now at the US DOT. I mean, he is saying things on Twitter that, I worked sort of mid-level at the city of Boulder. I would have gotten fired if I said some of the things he's saying on Twitter about, highways are racist. It's fabulous, right? He has the megaphone. He's saying a lot of great things. So I think there's this real interest and, energy and really opportunity to make change at a federal level. And yet every one of us that has worked on transportation for a while knows that change really happens locally, that you can, maybe you can help from a federal level. You can change some of the guidance, certainly controls a lot of the money, but so much of this, the effective advocacy is at a local level, and folks know what they need in their neighborhood, in their city, in their community. And we have been so bad at listening to that, communities of color that get, plowed out of the way, destroyed, not figuratively destroyed, but physically destroyed so that we widen highways. And, where are those voices? So let's talk about that community self-determination piece, because I also think philanthropy struggles with that, right? Philanthropy likes to come in with solutions, right? We've got the answer. I mean, I know me, right? Like, okay, we build protected bike lanes, got the answer, let's go. How are you all sort of bridging those gaps between, like we say, we know we need to do something about transportation and mobility without like Bigfooting your way into the community and saying, I'm here from the government or I'm here from philanthropy and let me tell you what you need to do. Oh, that was my little rant. Okay, who wants to dive in on that?
I'll go
Lisa?
first.
Oh,
Lisa, you want to go first? Okay. So I think the three of us are collectively involved in a start towards that. There is a transportation justice group of, I want to say 50 grassroots organizations that are very much on the ground, very much understand what the lack of transit service provides, but they're also not just transit advocates. They also advocate for bike safety, for bikes, for walking. And I think that's the first step, is to give them the ability to learn from each other and to also provide a variety of tools. Back when we first started this foundation program, we supported NACDO for their design guides to help people dream, because the industrial complex that is transportation doesn't want outside people to have an opinion that it's educated and well thought out. And so providing more tools, more knowledge, but then also giving agency and knowledge to a wider set of people on the ground forces the conversation to be, if you want to talk technical, we have people on the ground. There are people on the ground who are capable of talking technical. I think that listening to the user experience is where I think the power lies within bringing about change.
Yeah, picking up on that last thread, Darryl, that's really how we've been trying to orient. It's not so much, wow, this is a great street in your neighborhood to have a dedicated transit lane, but let's start with, what do you need in your neighborhood? Because it might be that you need better street lights, or you might need cleaner sidewalks or more trash cans, or the trash being picked up regularly. And for a lot of communities to really trust what government can do for transportation starts with what some of those basic needs are. And we've been trying to model that during the pandemic. You know, there's a lot of silver linings, and one of them, I think, for Barr has been providing a lot of flexibility to our grantees. And maybe they had a really, really big transportation agenda at the beginning of 2020, but they said, we need to pivot on our policy priorities, and we're going to be focusing on food distribution and childcare. And we said, great, please do that. And that is listening to community. That's really, not thinking about the technocratic stuff and more about what the needs are. And the transportation stuff is going to come. We all know it's a basic need. It's a public good. We'll get there. So I think that listening piece, the knowing what the need is and having the process follow that has been really becoming more and more central to what we're doing at Barr.
I agree with all of that. And I think that two things. One is, for me, there's definitely had to be a shift and a bit of humility in like what I define transportation to be. And to Lisa's point, right? Like a lot of it's about access to basic goods and services. But I was actually talking to an amazing grantee and partner, and they were talking about transportation programs, and they talked about a community garden. And I was like, all for community gardens. Love my community garden is next door to me. It's part of why I live where I live. Like, love it. What? Right? Like I think about this all day, every day. And it took someone who I very much trust, and who I have open communications with, to be like, getting to a grocery store was the challenge, and what basically made the transportation necessary in having healthy food in the community that people could go pick. It addressed transportation, and it was just, again, obvious, logical, so clear to the folks in the community, and just, it was an epiphany for me, which that's on me. But I think there's a lot of that in transportation, that the solutions might actually, to Lisa's point, have nothing to do with even a sidewalk or a street or a plug, right? And I think that that's really important, that we not be prescriptive. And, I think there are important like I do transportation funding. I can say this has to go further transportation emissions reductions, but how you do that, there are millions of ways. And if we open that door, I think the amazing and talented folks doing this work are going to walk through.
Yeah, absolutely. One good example beyond the garden example is the health example. So, traditionally we look at commuter trips as the measure for whether or not we're reducing the amount of individual car use. But in fact, if you looked at the lack of access to healthcare because of the lack of transportation, where we both cite hospitals and the times those hospitals are running and the time that the transit is available, you find a disconnect. And if you want to reduce the healthcare costs, people need to be able to get to the hospital or to the doctor quickly and easily. Otherwise, they'll put it off, and then the catastrophic costs to society exponentially increases. So you're absolutely right. Transportation touches on food, it touches on health, and yet other health funders, food funders, don't completely, it's not within their panoply of things they got to work on. So I think if there's anything that we can invite, I think it's inviting health funders on board, inviting food funders on board for basic access to services and goods.
Totally
education.
Yeah,
the daughter of two professors
absolutely.
that got a.
Yep.
A big piece of this too is communication and knowing what the system is and how to use it and how it works, right? Like going back when Martha referenced parking, I mean, people go to the mall because they know how it works. It's easy. You know where to park. It's usually free. You just see where you're going. It's much more complicated in towns or in downtowns. One of the things that we've been doing to really kind of get the word out about public transit during the pandemic is provided a grant to El Mundo, a Spanish-speaking newspaper, both print and digital, on like what changes is the MBTA making? Like what routes do have more bus service, which have less? Why is there why do I now see a bus lane? What is this thing? Interviewing riders and public officials about what this is. We can't communicate enough about transportation, how it works, what's going on. So it's often an overlooked but really important strategy, especially when it's in the language where I don't know if it's a majority of MBTA bus riders, but a good portion of MBTA bus riders only speak Spanish.
So how does that actually show up in your grant making? This desire to take a broader view of transportation and mobility, and, is it that you're funding different groups that aren't, we have a whole host of really great transportation advocacy groups that, I'd say are sort of mainstream transportation advocacy groups, have been doing the work for a long time. There's also other groups that I think I worked on a project around zero emission delivery, talking to frontline groups, right? And they're like, we're working on freight, we're working on walking, we're working on land use, we're working on parks, we're working on, so many things. And that doesn't always fit sort of the traditional sort of issue-oriented, solution-oriented model. So how are you guys navigating that, that broader landscape that I think is really important to recognize and understand? Sorry, that wasn't exactly one of the three questions. We'll get to the third one, but it feels like it fits in that community self-determination bucket.
So I will chime in and say, as Darryl mentioned, I'm very lucky at EF to have partners in our cities team who have been working really closely with folks in the cities and the communities for a long time. And I have the benefit of working with and learning from them. And I think that one thing I have learned in the past year, my whole 1 year, is a lot actually happens on the grant making side that can be done to make it more equitable, more accessible, and honestly just center the folks who have the answers more. And let me just also say, it is not perfect. We are still very much one of our colleagues calls it the philanthropic industrial complex, right? Like there's still a lot of weight and stuff for us to dissect, but there's everything from different structures for the grants to just move away from deliverables to you're going to do XYZ reports to you're going to work towards this goal that we share and you're going to develop the strategy and then you can share it with us and we'll learn from you, a lot more co-creation. I think the other big thing is the false urgency, which I definitely fall into the trap of this opportunity is happening right now. And in reality, like Lisa said, like Darryl said, transportation is a system. It's going to take years and we need to do all of it. It's yes and all day, every day, right? So let's create the time and the space. And then the third is to your point about different groups. Absolutely. I think there has long been, speaking for myself anyway, you talk to folks you share vocabulary with, right? And that crosses a lot of modes and a lot of intersectionality there. But I think going beyond the folks, at least for me, EF has traditionally funded vehicles, right? Like cars. That's been most of what we've done some great work. We need to electrify all cars, 100%. Also need trucks and transit. And that doesn't mean everyone who has a car right now has to keep a car, right? And so even having conversations with folks where it's like, you don't have to mention vehicles, right? Like there can be work on transportation that's entirely about livable communities or entirely around bikes or rails to trails, right? All of that's transportation and you can never say the word. And so I think changing and opening our vocabulary in philanthropy is also really important to work with the other groups. And my filibuster there.
Yeah. I think in the last year, there has been a genuine shift, a tectonic shift in the way transportation is being viewed. You know, traditionally it was federal government authorized a certain amount of money. Philanthropy, I would say probably 6 or 7 years ago, got really into it, you know, lobbied up, went to influence the federal government, and then they just kind of disappeared because of the gridlock that existed in DC. There's a new set of funders, some old funders, but new set of funders that see it in this multivariate way, that it is about equity, it is about climate, it is about health. And if you told me a year ago to this day that there would be $69 billion for transit, for operations, and that would pass with overwhelming bipartisan support, at least in concept, right? Not the entire package, but it would be seen. No one would call it out to be pulled out. I would say not possible, not happening. And yet here we are with the support that the three of us have supported a set of activists, a set of active people on the ground, as well as people on the Hill, inside outside game. Here we are, $69 billion for transit operations, right? And now they're going for continued operations. So I think we've proven that we can make a difference by supporting the right set of people with a tiny bit of work. So I would say that probably collectively, we probably gave no more than maybe $500,000 or $600,000. And that triggered 69, now it's too easy to say this, but I will, $69 billion, right? And now we have trillions of dollars that will last for 5 years or more coming on the path. So how do we as funders bring other funders in to bite off a bit of that Kit Kat bar? That's a bad metaphor, but nevertheless, how do we get some of that for the people who need it most? And those people are hungering for it. That's part of the reason why we started the Mobility Fund, was to get the people on the ground together and to work up the food chain, up the information chain, and down the information chain. So I think things are changing, and I think part of it is because of people like Aminah and Lisa really saying there's a different way to do this.
Lisa?
Credit is due there to you too, Darryl.
Thanks.
Pulling us together.
So Lisa, I think we're running short on time, and I think Darryl provided a really nice segue into our final topic, which was Aminah's note that, you know, transportation is the biggest source of climate emissions, and yet is probably the least funded sector of the climate fight. And we've all drunk the Kool-Aid, right? We've created the Mobility Fund. We have a collaborative. We're hoping to bring more funders into the space. Like, what's your message for other funders that might come across this video, right? Already self-selecting, right? Why would they watch something about mobility? But, you know, if they're trying to figure out how to get more involved, understand this better, learn where to invest, navigate the Byzantine decision-making process, what's your, what's your pep talk for funders to come into this space and connect it to all the other work that they're doing, you know, the broader systems change work that they're doing? Lisa, or is anybody ready with a pep talk?
I don't know if I have my pep talk ready, okay. But I think that people understand that, based on personal experience, that transportation is connected to everything that we do. And again, referencing the pandemic that we're still in, when we saw the need for essential workers to get to where they're going, and what percentage of them, which was like about a third, according to Transit Center, that rode on transit to get to their hospitals and grocery stores and other places that they had to be, is a really big number. It is an essential piece of access, economic opportunity, and, as you said, Martha, you know, the biggest proportion of emissions. I feel like now that we've kind of gotten our buildings and energy sector down a bit, we're going to have no choice. If funders are interested in climate, which a lot of them are, we're going to have to tackle this together. And we can also expand our definitions too. There's a lot of funders that are working on broadband. And when I think about transportation, I know it's part of it, but it's not what we do. But, to throw in at least one transportation pun here, maybe we had one before. It's a two-way street, right? We think about mode shift, we think about walking, biking, and transit, but the definition of sustainable transportation is a lot bigger, to include broadband and community gardens and access to what people need.
Yeah, I love the recent conversation on Twitter around infrastructure. Like childcare is infrastructure. I called transportation infrastructure, and that's maybe the, more traditional definition of it. But our infrastructure is so much broader than just, buses and highways. Aminah.
I think my pep talk's a weird thing. But building off of Lisa, there's nothing it doesn't connect to, right? Transportation is at the core of everything, right? And I think a big piece for me is around changing that vocabulary, changing that thinking. But, I think if folks actually question the status quo, right, of what they think about transportation and what it means to them, a lot more folks would be engaged in the space, right? My favorite example is people talk about transportation like it's not the built environment, right? We have the built environment, and then we have mobile sourced emissions. A bus station is built, an EV charger is built, a protected bike lane is built. And maybe I'm too literal, as my mother continues to tell me for many, many decades, but it's built. This is not just mobile. And so I think even folks who think from the building side, for example, or built environment side, there could be a lot there. So we just need to expand and open, and also nerds abound. I do not know a lot about a lot of things, but oh my God, there's so many amazing transportation nerds who will explain and work with you on anything you want to do. And that's half the fun, because now I know more about congestion pricing and the gas tax.
Darryl?
First of all, I reject your notion that we've drunk the Kool-Aid, because people who drink the Kool-Aid in Guyana died. So I don't intend on dying. I don't know about you, but I will say is that it's like peanuts. You can't have one. And there are all kinds of different nuts, and we're all nuts in one way or the other. Let me just say that with regards to transportation, we cannot get there. We cannot get there for a fair, equitable, clean, healthy planet unless we factor in transportation. Transportation is both a social vehicle, it is both a physical vehicle, it is also a mental vehicle on how we get to where we want to be. So if you're not on the bus, on the train, on the bike, we cannot get there. So I would ask most foundations, where is your transportation game? What are you doing on transportation? It should be part of good governance. If you're a community foundation, where are you on transportation? It's not enough to have a park. It is important, but how do you get to that park? You need transportation. So I think that's the message, that if we care about climate, we've got to start funding transportation. And the advantage is there are a set of funders that have been going through the learning process now for a good number of years, and there are no wrong answers. I mean, we welcome anyone coming on board with us and, contribute to the Mobility and Access Collaborative, contribute to the Mobility Fund. There are other funds that are going to be coming out, which is a good sign of increased interest. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. We have a final wrap-up question. I want to thank our speakers. If Secretary Buttigieg has a train, what color is the train?
That wasn't the question we agreed to.
It wasn't. What
green.
Was it?
It's green.
Okay. I agree. It has to be green, but it has to have flames painted on the side. To be cool, it needs flames.
I think to be cool, it can be green and it can have flames, but it also needs a very big headshot of Biden wearing those aviator shades.
And eating ice cream. Right?
Who wouldn't want to get on that train?
Okay, and it's going to visit every community that's doing fabulous work on the ground. Okay.
It's a fleet of trains, and it's coming regularly and dependably with frequency.
And it never switches to diesel.
Exactly.
It connects people to jobs and parks and places they want to go. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Bye-bye.
All right.